The smell of diesel and dead grass hung in the air the morning Ethan Miller first walked his uncle's land. It was not much to look at. A narrow strip of forgotten earth wedged between two working farms, maybe 40 acres of weeds and silence. The kind of land people drove past without turning their heads. A rusted fence leaned at an angle along the road, half swallowed by blackberry bramble, and beyond it, the field stretched flat and neglected under a pale October sky. Ethan stood at the edge of the gravel drive and stared at what he had inherited. His Uncle Ray had died alone in a veterans' hospital 2 counties over. No wife, no children, no funeral to speak of. Just a small notice in the county paper and a phone call from a lawyer Ethan had never heard of. The will was short. Everything Ray owned went to his nephew. Everything turned out to be this strip of land, a shed full of old tools, and a stack of unpaid property taxes that made Ethan's stomach turn. He had driven 4 hours from the city to see it. He was already behind on his own bills, 2 months late on rent, credit cards maxed out, a truck payment he had been dodging since August. He had taken the day off from his job at the warehouse, which meant losing a shift he could not afford to lose. But Ray had been the only family Ethan had left who ever felt like family. His mother had passed when Ethan was 19. His father had disappeared long before that, walked out one morning before sunrise and never came back, leaving nothing behind but a dent in the couch and a closet full of empty hangers. Uncle Ray was the one who filled the silence. He never said much. He was not the kind of man who talked about feelings or gave speeches at holiday dinners. But he showed up. When Ethan was 10 and his mother was working double shifts at the hospital, Ray drove 4 hours to pick him up and bring him to the farm for the summer. He taught Ethan how to change a tire, how to read a dipstick, how to hold a wrench without skinning his knuckles. He taught him that a man's hands tell you more about him than his words ever will. Every summer of Ethan's childhood, he spent 2 weeks on this land. He remembered the smell of it, cut grass and warm dirt, and the faint sweetness of clover blooming along the fence line. He remembered the sound of Ray's boots on the porch in the early morning, the creak of the screen door, the low hum of the radio playing country stations from 3 counties away. He remembered sitting on an overturned bucket in the shed while Ray filed a blade or tightened a fitting. The only sound between them the rasp of metal and the buzz of a wasp trapped against the window glass. Ray never explained what he was doing or why. He just worked, and Ethan watched, and somehow that was enough. Now the quiet was all that remained. Ethan walked the perimeter slowly, hands in the pockets of his Carhartt jacket, boots crunching through dry stubble. The shed was padlocked, but the lock was so corroded it broke apart in his hand. Inside, he found the usual debris of a man who never threw anything away. Coffee cans full of bolts, a sagging workbench, mouse-chewed rags, jars of nails sorted by size and labeled in Ray's careful handwriting. He almost missed the tractor. It was at the far edge of the property, half sunken into the weeds where the field met a shallow drainage ditch. The grass had grown up around it so thick that from a distance it looked like just another mound of earth. But when Ethan pushed through the brush, he saw the shape of it. A hulking machine sitting low on flat tires, its body covered in a layer of rust and old paint so thick it looked like bark. There were no plates, no clear markings. The seat was cracked and black with mildew, and the steering wheel was caked in mud. Someone had wrapped a canvas tarp over part of it at some point, but the tarp had rotted through and hung in strips like dead skin. Chains lay coiled in the dirt nearby, half buried, along with a few hand tools, a pry bar, a socket wrench, a screwdriver with a wooden handle worn smooth. Ethan crouched beside it and ran his hand along the fender. The metal was rough and pitted under his fingers. 3, maybe 4 layers of paint had been slapped on over the years. Green, over red, over gray, over something darker underneath. None of the colors matched. The rear axle housing looked like it came from a different machine entirely, and the exhaust stack had been replaced with a section of pipe that did not quite fit. He stood up and wiped his hands on his jeans. "What were you hiding out here, Ray?" He said to no one. The next morning, Ethan drove into town to file the deed transfer at the county clerk's office. The woman behind the counter recognized the address and gave him a look that was half pity, half amusement. "That's the Miller Strip," she said. "Your uncle held on to that land for 30 years. Nobody could figure out why." Ethan asked about the tractor. She shook her head. "Honey, there's a scrap yard on Route 12 that'll give you $400 for that thing if you can get it on a trailer. That's the best advice I can give you." He heard the same thing at the feed store, the gas station, the diner where he stopped for coffee. Everyone in town seemed to know the land and the man who had owned it, and everyone had the same opinion. Drag the tractor away, sell the scrap, unload the acreage to one of the neighboring farms, and walk away with whatever you can get. "Your uncle was a good man," said Dale Harmon, who ran the hardware store and had known Ray for decades. "But he was stubborn as a fence post, held on to that land like it owed him something. You don't want to make the same mistake." Ethan thanked him and bought a can of penetrating oil, a wire brush, and a new set of socket wrenches. He started on the tractor the following Saturday. He did not know exactly why. There was no logical reason to spend time on a machine that was clearly dead. He should have been looking for weekend work, picking up extra shifts, doing anything that put cash in his hand. But something about the tractor pulled at him. Not sentiment, not nostalgia, but a feeling he could not name. Something was wrong with it. Not wrong in the way a broken machine is wrong. Wrong in the way a story is wrong when someone has left pieces out. The body had been repainted too many times. Parts did not match the frame. The canvas cover, the chains, the tools scattered in the dirt. None of it looked like the remains of a machine that had simply been parked and forgotten. It looked like a machine that had been hidden. He started by clearing the brush around it, cutting back the grass and weeds until the full shape of the tractor emerged in the thin autumn light. It was bigger than he had first thought. A heavy machine, built for pulling, not for show. The front grille was dented and patched, with a piece of sheet metal that had been riveted on by hand. The engine cowling was secured with mismatched bolts, some new, some old, as if someone had opened it many times over the years. Ethan popped the cowling and looked inside. The engine was filthy, but intact. No missing parts, no obvious cracks in the block. He sprayed penetrating oil into the cylinders and let it sit. Then he started on the outside, working the wire brush across the fender in long strokes, scraping away rust and old paint until sweat ran down his back despite the cold. Under the third layer of paint, he found something. A serial stamp. Not a factory plate, those were long gone, but a number stamped directly into the metal of the frame near the front axle mount. The digits were shallow and uneven, clearly done by hand with a punch set. He brushed the rust away carefully and copied the number into his phone. Below the stamp, barely visible under decades of corrosion, was a mark he did not recognize. A small symbol that looked like two crossed furrow lines inside a circle. It had been etched into the metal, not stamped. Someone had taken time with it. Ethan sat back on his heels and stared at it for a long time. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table of the small rental he was staying in and searched the serial number online. Nothing came up. He searched for the symbol. Nothing. He called Dale Harmon at the hardware store and described what he had found. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "That symbol," Dale said slowly. "I haven't seen that in years. But I know what it is. That was Burl Ackerman's mark." Ethan had never heard the name. "You wouldn't have," Dale said. "Not many people talk about Burl anymore. But back in the 60s and 70s, he was one of the best farmers in the county. Won the tractor pull at the county fair 3 years running. Custom built his own machines. That circle with the furrow lines, he put that on everything he made." Dale's voice dropped a notch. "Then one year, he accused some of the big landowners of cheating him out of his property. Said they had forged documents, manipulated surveys, pressured the assessor. He made a real stink about it at the fair, stood up on the bed of his truck in the middle of the grandstand and called them out by name." "What happened?" Ethan asked. "What always happens when a working man goes against people with money. They buried him. Lawyers, liens, tax audits. Within 2 years, he was ruined. Lost his land, his equipment, everything. Disappeared from the county fair circuit and nobody saw him again. Some people said he left the state. Some said he died. Nobody knew for sure, and after a while, nobody cared. But his tractor survived," Ethan said. "If that's really Burl's machine," Dale said carefully, "then somebody went to a lot of trouble to keep it hidden. Burl's tractors were the proof of his work. The modifications, the engineering, all custom. The people who took his land made sure every piece of his equipment was seized or destroyed. If one survived." He trailed off. "Then someone saved it on purpose," Ethan finished. Dale was quiet for a moment. "Your Uncle Ray worked for Burl one summer when he was young. Did he ever mention that?" "No." Ray had never mentioned that. Ray had never mentioned Burl Ackerman at all. Over the next 3 weeks, Ethan spent every free hour on the tractor. He worked in the mornings before his warehouse shift and in the evenings after, driving out to the property in the dark, setting up a trouble light and a battery-powered radio, and losing himself in the work until his fingers went numb. The November air bit through his jacket. The ground froze hard beneath his knees. But there was something about the labor, the rhythm of it, the focus it required, that felt like the closest thing to peace he had known in months. He drained the old fuel, a black syrup that smelled like vinegar and sulfur, and flushed the lines with fresh solvent until they ran clean. He rebuilt the carburetor with parts he ordered online, sitting at his kitchen table with a magnifying glass and a printout of the assembly diagram, matching each tiny jet and gasket to its place. He replaced the battery, the spark plugs, the ignition wiring. He pulled the tires off the rims and had them resealed at a shop 2 towns over because the local tire place refused to work on something that old. "You're putting money into a corpse," the tire man told him, not unkindly. Maybe he was. There were nights when Ethan lay in bed staring at the ceiling and wondered if everyone was right. He was behind on rent. His supervisor at the warehouse had written him up twice. His truck needed an alternator, and he was driving on borrowed time. Every dollar he spent on parts for the tractor was a dollar that should have gone somewhere else. But then he would think about the serial stamp, the symbol, the layers of paint, each one a different color, each one someone's attempt to make the machine look like something it was not. And the tools and chains in the dirt, not scattered randomly, but placed deliberately, as if to say, "This thing is dead. Do not look closer." The work was slow and hard. His hands cracked in the cold. His back ached from bending over the engine. Some nights he worked until midnight and drove home with grease under his fingernails and the smell of old iron in his hair. He ate cold sandwiches standing at the kitchen counter because he was too tired to cook and too wired to sleep. People in town started talking. "Ethan Miller's out there every weekend working on that pile of rust," someone would say at the diner, and the rest of the table would shake their heads. They said he was wasting his time. They said he was chasing a ghost story. They said his uncle had been eccentric, and the nephew was turning out the same way. Ethan heard the talk and kept working. He stripped more paint from the frame and found more of Burl's modifications. A reinforced hitch plate welded with a technique Ethan had never seen. A custom PTO housing machined from a single piece of steel. A steering linkage redesigned for tighter turning. Every piece he uncovered told the same story. This machine had been built by someone who understood metal the way a musician understands sound. In the shed, buried under a pile of mouse-chewed canvas and old feed sacks, he found a wooden box. The lid was swollen shut with moisture, and he had to pry it open with a flathead screwdriver. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept it mostly dry, was a leather-bound notebook. The leather was cracked and dark with age. The pages were water-stained at the edges, brittle as dead leaves. But the writing inside was still legible. Pencil sketches and handwritten measurements in a careful, slanting hand that was not Ray's. The drawings showed tractor components in precise detail: gears, shafts, linkages, cross-sections of custom housings. Alongside them were notes, calculations, material specifications, angles measured to the 10th of a degree. This was not an amateur's notebook. This was the work of an engineer. On the inside front cover, in faded ink, was a name: B. Ackerman. Ethan turned to the last page. There, in a different ink and a different hand, Ray's handwriting, unmistakable, the same careful block letters Ethan had seen on the jars of nails in the shed, were 4 words: he deserved the truth. Ethan closed the notebook and held it against his chest. His heart was beating hard. The shed was cold and dark around him, the only sound the wind pushing against the walls and the faint tick of something settling in the rafters. He sat there for a long time, holding the notebook, before he stood up and walked out into the light. Ethan took the notebook to the County Historical Society. The woman who ran it, Mrs. Fry, 82 years old and sharp as a new blade, recognized Burl's name immediately. "Burl Ackerman was the finest mechanic this county ever produced," she said, turning the pages of the notebook with careful fingers. "And what they did to him was a crime. Not in the legal sense, they made sure of that, but in every other sense that matters." She told Ethan the rest of the story. She spoke slowly, carefully, the way people speak when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time and are finally setting it down. Burl had owned 160 acres of bottomland along the creek, some of the richest soil in the county. Black loam, 18 inches deep, the kind of dirt that grew corn so tall you could lose a man in it by July. Burl's family had farmed that land since 1919. 3 generations of Ackermans had worked it, improved it, built it into one of the most productive operations in the township. In 1971, a group of investors connected to the Halstead family wanted to consolidate that stretch of the valley for a large-scale operation. They had already bought out 4 smaller farms. Burl's land was the last piece they needed. They offered him a price. Burl refused to sell, so they found another way. A surveyor's report was filed that moved his property line 80 feet to the east, cutting off his access to the creek and the irrigation rights that came with it. A tax reassessment doubled his burden overnight. When Burl couldn't pay, the county seized the land and sold it at auction to the Halsteads. The whole thing took less than 18 months. Burl fought it. He had his own survey, his own records, and the tractor he had built with his own hands as proof of the work he had done on that land. But the records disappeared from the courthouse. His surveyor recanted under pressure, and Burl's equipment was confiscated as part of the tax lien and supposedly sold for scrap. All except one tractor, Mrs. Fry said, looking at Ethan over her glasses. The one everybody said was destroyed, the one with his mark on it. My uncle hid it, Ethan said. Your uncle was 17 years old when Burl lost everything. He worked for Burl that last summer, and he saw what happened. I think it haunted him for the rest of his life. She paused. Ray bought that strip of land in 1993. Nobody understood why. It was the worst piece of property in the township. But I think he bought it because it was the one place nobody would ever look. Ethan went back to the tractor that night. He worked under a trouble light hung from a post, his breath clouding in the November air, the smell of old grease and cold metal sharp in his nostrils. He turned the engine over by hand, feeling the pistons move, feeling the compression build. The metal was cold under his palms, but it felt alive, resistant, stubborn, like it was testing him. He checked the fuel line one more time, tightened the last connection on the ignition, primed the carburetor with a squirt of ether, and stepped back. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his landlord. Final notice. He looked at the screen for a moment, then put the phone away and picked up the wrench. He had been working on this machine for almost a month. He had spent money he did not have on parts he was not sure would work. He had ignored every piece of sensible advice anyone had given him. He had done all of this because a dead man's notebook said 4 words, and because something in his gut, something he could not explain and did not try to, told him that this machine mattered. If it did not start tonight, he did not know what he would do. He turned the key. Nothing happened. He tried again. A click. A groan. The starter motor whined, strained, caught, and the engine coughed once, twice, belched a cloud of black smoke that smelled like 50 years of silence, and then it settled into a rough, unsteady idle that shook the whole frame. The headlights, wired in new that afternoon, threw 2 yellow beams across the dark field, illuminating the weeds and the fence and the empty road beyond. Ethan sat in the cracked seat with his hands on the wheel and felt the machine vibrate beneath him. His eyes burned. His throat was tight. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper, something that came from the same place as the lump in his chest. He did not move for a long time. The engine ran. It ran the way Burl Ackerman had built it to run, deep and strong, with a sound like a heartbeat in the ground. He drove the tractor into town on a Saturday morning in early December. The air was sharp and still. Frost lay white across the fields and the sun was low, casting long shadows across the road. Ethan came down Main Street at a walking pace, the old machine rumbling beneath him, the exhaust stack sending a thin column of smoke into the gray sky. The tractor's tires left dark prints on the frozen asphalt. The sound of the engine echoed off the storefronts, a deep, rhythmic thudding that made people turn and look. And they did look. A woman outside the bakery stopped mid-step and dropped her shopping bag. 2 men at the gas station turned from the pump and watched with their mouths open. A kid on a bicycle pulled over and stared. Dale Harmon came out of the hardware store and stood with his arms folded on the sidewalk, watching, not saying a word. His expression was unreadable, something between disbelief and recognition, as if he were seeing a ghost he had always known would come back. Ethan parked the tractor in front of the county courthouse. He had called the county clerk, the historical society, and a reporter from the regional paper. He had copies of Burl's notebook, photographs of the serial stamp and the mark, and a folder of documents Mrs. Fry had helped him locate, including the original survey from 1968 that contradicted the one used to seize Burl's land. The story ran on the front page of the paper the following Wednesday. Within a week, a law professor from the state university contacted Ethan. Within 2 weeks, a historical preservation group offered to document the tractor and Burl's engineering work. Within a month, the County Board of Supervisors agreed to open an inquiry into the original land seizure, something that had not been possible in decades because there had been no surviving physical evidence. The tractor was the evidence. Burl's custom modifications, his serial stamp, his engineering notebook. Together they proved that a man had worked that land, built something extraordinary on it, and been erased. The tractor was the one thing the Halsteads had not been able to destroy, because a 17-year-old boy had dragged it into the weeds and buried it under canvas and chains and 40 years of silence. The Halstead family, or what remained of it, pushed back at first. Their lawyer issued a statement calling the whole thing a misunderstanding based on incomplete records. But the records were no longer incomplete. Mrs. Fry had spent decades quietly collecting documents, letters, and depositions from people who had known Burl. She had been waiting for someone to come forward with the missing piece. The tractor was the missing piece. In January, the county board voted to formally acknowledge that Burl Ackerman's land had been taken through fraudulent means. It was not a legal reversal. Too many years had passed for that. But it was a public admission of what had been done. Burl's name was read into the official record. A photograph of his tractor was entered as Exhibit A. The room was packed. Farmers who had heard the story drove in from neighboring counties. Old-timers who remembered Burl sat in the front row, some of them crying quietly, some of them just nodding as if a wrong they had carried for decades was finally being spoken aloud. A man in his 70s stood up during the public comment period. He said his name was Carl Ackerman. He was Burl's son. The room went silent. Carl had been 12 years old when his father lost the land. He had watched his father fight and lose and eventually leave the county with nothing but a suitcase and a broken spirit. Burl had moved to a small town in Nebraska, worked in a factory, and died in 1998 without ever coming back. My father never stopped talking about this place, Carl said, his voice steady but thin. He never stopped believing that somebody would find the truth. I just didn't think it would take this long. Ethan sat in the back of the meeting room and listened. His hands were still cracked from the cold. His rent was still overdue. His truck still needed a new alternator. Nothing about his financial situation had changed, but something else had changed. Something that did not fit on a balance sheet. After the meeting, Carl Ackerman found Ethan in the hallway. He was a tall man, lean and weathered, with hands that looked like they had spent a lifetime working. He took Ethan's hand and held it. "Your uncle saved the only thing my father had left," Carl said. "I don't have the words for what that means." Ethan did not know what to say, so he did what Ray would have done. He nodded, and he held on. Later, in the parking lot, Dale Harmon found him leaning against his truck. "Your uncle would have been proud," Dale said. He handed Ethan a brown paper bag. Inside was a bottle of good bourbon and a note that read, "For Ray." Ethan drove back to the land that evening. The sun was already low, painting the western sky in shades of copper and ash. He parked beside the tractor, which sat where he had left it near the shed, its metal gleaming dull in the winter light. The field stretched out around him, flat and quiet and cold. A hawk circled high overhead, riding a thermal, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked twice and fell silent. He opened the bourbon, poured a measure into a tin cup from the shed, and sat on the tractor's running board. The metal was cold through his jeans. The bourbon caught the last of the light. He thought about Ray, a man who had seen an injustice as a boy and spent his whole life guarding the proof, who never told anyone, who never asked for credit or recognition or thanks, who bought a worthless strip of land and let the world think he was eccentric, let his neighbors shake their heads, let the years pile up like rust on metal, who trusted that someday, somehow, someone would come along and ask the right questions. That was the kind of man Ray was. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, the way a fence post is steady, driven deep into the ground, holding the line, doing its job whether anyone noticed or not. He thought about Burl Arian, a man who built machines the way cathedrals are built, with precision and pride in the belief that good work speaks for itself, who lost everything to men who understood paper better than they understood soil, who disappeared from his own county like a name erased from a chalkboard, but whose mark survived because it had been pressed into metal, not written on a page. And he thought about the tractor. It sat beside him in the fading light, heavy and real, not beautiful, not valuable in any way the market would recognize, just an old machine that had been painted over, buried under weeds, and written off as scrap by everyone who looked at it without seeing. But it was the one thing that could not stay buried. Some truths are like that. You can cover them up, paint over them, drag them into the weeds and walk away. But the metal remembers. The marks go deep, and soon